June 4, 1942. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the command deck of the carrier Akagi, observing the return of his aerial squadrons from their assault on Midway Atoll. Behind him, the controlled disarray of a carrier's flight deck during active combat operations unfolded. Deck crew guiding aircraft into position, ordnance teams maneuvering bombs and torpedoes, pilots disembarking from their cockpits. The morning sun cast a gleam upon the Pacific Ocean, and 4 immense carriers advanced in formation, their decks laden with aircraft. In every conceivable respect, Nagumo understood, events were proceeding as anticipated. Then, a radio man presented him with a dispatch. 7:28 in the morning. The message was concise, rendered in neat characters. 10 vessels, reportedly enemy, sighted bearing 010 degrees, 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed exceeding 20 knots. Nagumo read the transmission twice. His countenance, according to officers stationed nearby, became utterly still, not with surprise nor alarm, but a profound, motionless state, as if his consciousness had abruptly ceased processing the external world and turned entirely inward. For 6 months since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, this formidable strike force comprising 4 fleet carriers, had swept across the Pacific like an implacable tempest. They had struck Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Saipan, Colombo. They had neutralized 2 British capital ships. They had encountered no significant resistance. And now, here, amidst what was meant to be a straightforward operation to seize a modest outpost, there were American vessels where no American vessels were expected to be. 10 ships, Nagumo stated softly, to no one in particular. His staff officers drew closer. The admiral raised his gaze from the message. "Where are their carriers?" No one responded, for no one possessed the answer. The reconnaissance plane that transmitted the report, a float plane launched from the cruiser Tone, delayed due to catapult malfunctions, had not specified the types of ships encountered, whether they were cruisers, destroyers, or something more formidable. Nagumo turned to his operations officer. "Transmit orders to ascertain ship types and maintain contact." On the flight deck below, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga had just exited his aircraft. His plane had spearheaded the assault on Midway, with 108 aircraft delivering ordnance upon the American installations there for 30 minutes. Now he stood on the deck, still clad in his flight suit, and relayed his findings to the air operations staff. "A second strike is necessary. Enemy installations remain operational." This revelation presented an immediate complication. When Tomonaga's strike had launched before dawn, Nagumo had retained a secondary wave of aircraft in reserve. 93 planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs intended for engagement with naval targets. This was standard doctrine. A reserve was maintained in the event that enemy carriers materialized, but no enemy carriers had appeared. The morning had been characterized instead by ineffectual attacks from Midway-based aircraft, land-based bombers that missed their targets widely, torpedo planes that approached at slow speeds and were shot down. Nothing indicated the proximity of any carrier. Consequently, Nagumo had made a decision: rearm the reserve aircraft with land bombs for a second offensive against Midway. That directive had been issued at 7:15, 13 minutes prior. Throughout the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance crews were already engaged in the task of removing torpedoes, transporting them to storage, and bringing up land bombs. This was intricate, time-consuming work. And now, a message indicated the presence of enemy vessels somewhere in the distance, 240 miles away. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air operations officer responsible for planning the Pearl Harbor attack, lay in his cabin, consumed by fever. He had been unwell for several days, but had insisted on not being left behind. Now, as staff officers conveyed the latest intelligence, he pushed himself up on his elbows. "What types?" he inquired immediately. "Unknown," an officer responded. "The scout is maintaining contact. We are awaiting clarification." Genda's face, already flushed with fever, tensed. "If carriers are present," he stated, his voice strained, "we must launch immediately, even with only the aircraft currently prepared." However, Nagumo did not launch. He waited. 15 minutes elapsed. 20. The Akagi's deck was teeming with aircraft returning from the Midway strike, landing sequentially, with handlers rushing to move them below or push them aside to clear space for the next arrival. It was impossible to launch a strike with a deck occupied by landing aircraft. Recovery had to precede launch. Furthermore, the scouts had yet to report the types of vessels. At 7:45, a second dispatch arrived. Enemy force comprises 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief, palpable and immediate, washed over Nagumo's features. Cruisers and destroyers, not carriers. The Americans had deployed a surface contingent, likely intending to intercept the invasion fleet bound for Midway. This was a manageable threat, in fact, precisely the kind of target his torpedo-equipped aircraft were designed to neutralize. Except, his aircraft were no longer armed with torpedoes. They were in the process of being re-equipped with land bombs. Nagumo turned to his staff. "Rearm with torpedoes," he commanded. "Prepare to engage the enemy surface force after we recover the Midway strike group." Thus, the ordnance crews, who had spent the preceding 30 minutes removing torpedoes and loading land bombs, now reversed their efforts. Remove the land bombs. Retrieve the torpedoes. It was shortly after 8 o'clock. The Midway strike aircraft were still returning. The reserve aircraft, having been rearmed twice now, sat in the hangars while crews toiled with frantic energy. Torpedoes and bombs were strewn across the hangar decks, stacked against bulkheads, placed wherever available space permitted, as there was insufficient time to return them properly to the magazines deep within the ship. Then, at 8:59, a third message arrived from the scout plane. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Appears to be, not definitively is, but appears to be. Nagumo stared at the message. His staff officers fell into a profound silence. Captain Tairo Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer, stepped closer. "Admiral," he stated carefully, "if there is a carrier, we should launch without delay." "With what?" Nagumo's voice was sharp. "Half our aircraft are returning from Midway and require landing. The other half are undergoing rearmament. The decks are occupied." He gestured toward the visible, controlled chaos through the bridge windows. "We launch a partial strike with whatever is ready, or we wait 1 hour, complete recovery of all aircraft, finalize the rearmament, and launch a full strike." This was the pivotal decision, the moment that would define all subsequent events. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the carrier Hiryu, perceived the same situation and arrived at a different conclusion. He dispatched a message via signal lamp to Nagumo's flagship. Consider it advisable to launch the attack force immediately. Yamaguchi was audacious, recognized for it, and respected for it. He had contended prior to the battle that Japan should engage with 6 carriers, not 4, and should deploy overwhelming force. Now he advocated for immediate action, even if it entailed a partial strike. Launch whatever you have prepared. Get aircraft airborne. Engage them before they engage you. But Nagumo was not audacious. He was cautious, methodical, a man who had ascended through the ranks by avoiding errors. He examined Yamaguchi's dispatch and made his choice. Wait. Recover all aircraft, complete the rearmament, and launch a full, coordinated strike. It was the doctrinally sound decision, the course of action prescribed by the manual, what his training and experience dictated as correct. Thus, they waited. The Midway strike aircraft landed one after another. Tomonaga's plane touched down last at 8:30, trailing fuel from a ruptured tank. Handlers positioned aircraft, refueling crews connected hoses, and ordnance teams continued their rearming efforts in the hangars below. The 4 carriers sailed through placid seas, their decks crowded with aircraft, their hangars brimming with ordnance, their crews laboring at maximum capacity to prepare for an assault they now understood was imminent, directed against an American carrier contingent somewhere in the vicinity, undertaking the very same preparations. At 9:18, the initial American aircraft appeared. Not dive bombers or level bombers, but torpedo planes. 15 Douglas Devastators from the carrier Hornet, approaching from the east at low altitude and slow speed. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol Zeros, circling overhead, descended upon them immediately. What ensued was a massacre. The Devastators, obsolete and slow, attempted to penetrate barrages of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zeros. They released their torpedoes from excessive distances. Every torpedo missed its mark. 11 of the 15 aircraft were destroyed. The survivors limped away. On the Akagi's bridge, Nagumo observed the attack with grim satisfaction. "American torpedo planes," he remarked to his staff. "Poorly coordinated, ineffective." It was true. The assault had been courageous but futile. Not a single torpedo found its target, and no Japanese vessel sustained damage. If this represented the American capability, then Japan's superiority in training and equipment remained substantial. But the torpedo planes persisted. At 9:25, 14 additional Devastators appeared, these originating from the Enterprise. The Zeros and anti-aircraft batteries tore into them. 10 were shot down, their torpedoes missing. Then, at 9:35, 12 more arrived from the Yorktown. The pattern repeated. Brave, doomed attacks that drew the Japanese fighters down to wave height, diverting the combat air patrol from their higher patrols, and focusing every gun and every eye on the low-altitude threat approaching at mast height. Consequently, no one was observing the skies above. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, commenced a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers followed, splitting into 2 formations. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, their fuel reserves dwindling, on the verge of turning back when McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer proceeding northeastward and decided to pursue it. The destroyer, the Arashi, was hurrying to rejoin the carrier force after deploying depth charges against an American submarine. It led McCluskey directly to the carriers. Now, he dove upon the Akagi, and the Japanese failed to detect his approach until he was halfway down. On the bridge, a lookout suddenly shouted, "Dive bombers!" Nagumo spun around, looked upward, and saw them. Dark shapes plummeting from the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. What he uttered in that precise moment, no one definitively recorded. The bridge erupted in shouted commands. "Hard to starboard! Full evasion!" The Akagi began to turn, her massive hull responding sluggishly. Too sluggishly. The dive bombers descended in a steep, screaming plunge, and Nagumo could only watch as they released their ordnance. The first bomb missed, detonating in the water nearby, sending up a geyser. The second struck amidships, penetrating to the upper hangar deck. The third impacted near the aft elevator. 2 bombs out of 3 released on the Akagi. 2 bombs, each weighing 1,000 pounds, each penetrating deep into the vessel before detonating. On the hangar deck, where ordnance crews had been rearming aircraft for the preceding 2 hours, where torpedoes and bombs were stacked against bulkheads, where fuel lines ran and aviation gasoline circulated, the bombs detonated amidst fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes detonated. Within seconds, the entire hangar deck became a sea of fire. Nagumo felt the ship shudder. Smoke began to billow from the elevator openings. An officer ran onto the bridge, his face smudged with soot. "Hangar deck is afire! Multiple explosions! We are losing pressure on the fire mains!" Before Nagumo could respond, another lookout shouted. The admiral turned and saw, approximately 1,000 yards to starboard, the carrier Kaga, sister ship to the Akagi, the second largest carrier in the fleet, with 4 plumes of water erupting around her. Then he witnessed the bombs strike. 4 direct hits in rapid succession. The Kaga's flight deck erupted in flames. Her hangar deck exploded. Within a minute, she was burning as fiercely as the Akagi. And then, the Soryu, the third carrier, smaller and faster, maneuvering desperately. 3 bombs struck her in quick succession. Her flight deck peeled back like paper. Fire gouted from her hangar. 3 carriers hit within the span of 6 minutes, all ablaze, all doomed. On the Akagi's bridge, as smoke began to seep in and the deck tilted slightly beneath his feet, Nagumo stood frozen. An officer grasped his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." "Lost?" Nagumo repeated the word as if he did not comprehend it. "How can she be lost? We were just—" He paused. Around him, officers were shouting damage reports. The fire was beyond control. The engine rooms were still functional, but the ship could neither combat the flames nor launch aircraft. She was a floating inferno. Captain Aoki appeared, his uniform torn, his expression grim. "Admiral, I request permission to remain with the ship." "You must transfer to a cruiser and continue directing the battle." "The battle?" Nagumo said. He looked out at the Kaga burning, at the Soryu burning, 3/4 of his carrier strength gone in 6 minutes. He turned to his staff. "Where is Hiryu?" "Hiryu is undamaged," an officer reported. "She was separated from the main formation. The American dive bombers did not find her." One carrier remained. 1 out of 4. Nagumo nodded slowly. "Signal Hiryu. She is to launch all available aircraft immediately and attack the American carriers." At 10:28, 6 minutes after the dive bombers struck, Nagumo and his staff descended from the Akagi's bridge and made their way to the flight deck. The forward section of the ship was relatively clear of smoke, and a destroyer, the Nowaki, came alongside. Nagumo crossed over on a line, hand over hand. The commander of the Kido Butai, abandoning his flagship while she still floated, still moved through the water under her own power, but burned so fiercely that she could not be saved. From the Nowaki's deck, Nagumo watched his flagship burn. An officer standing nearby later recalled that the admiral said nothing. He simply stared at the Akagi, at the smoke pouring from her, at the flames visible through the hangar deck openings, and his face showed no expression whatsoever. Not grief, not anger, not shock, just a terrible, blank emptiness. 300 meters to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first reports at 11 o'clock. He was in the operations room, surrounded by staff officers, when a communications officer entered and handed him a message slip. Yamamoto read it, his expression impassive behind his reading glasses. Then he read it again. He removed his glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them on the table. "All carriers?" he inquired quietly. "3 confirmed, heavily damaged and burning, sir. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Hiryu is undamaged and launching a counterattack." Yamamoto stood motionless for a long moment. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, stood beside him, observing the admiral's face. Ugaki would later write in his diary that Yamamoto's expression in that moment was as if he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had cautioned Japan against engaging America, but then planned the operation that initiated the war, now confronted the consequences of his own strategy. He had wagered everything on this battle, on destroying the American carriers here at Midway and neutralizing the threat to Japan's defensive perimeter. And in the span of 6 minutes, the gamble had failed. "What is Nagumo's situation?" Yamamoto asked. "He has transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagata. He is attempting to direct operations from there." Yamamoto nodded. "Order all forces to continue the operation. We will support Nagumo with the main body. If Hiryu's strike succeeds, we may still achieve our objective." But even as he issued the order, Ugaki could discern that Yamamoto harbored no conviction. The admiral sat down heavily, and for the next several hours, as reports filtered in, he spoke very little. He issued orders, made decisions, maintained the semblance of command, but something had broken within him. Officers who had served with him for years stated they had never witnessed him in such a state, not angry, not agitated, just profoundly, deeply silent. On the Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi received news of the 3 lost carriers with a sharp inhalation. He was on the bridge, preparing to launch his own strike when the report arrived. "3 carriers burning," an officer stated. "Akagi, Kaga, Soryu." Yamaguchi's response was immediate and characteristic. "Launch everything," he ordered. "Every aircraft we possess, strike them with all we have." At 10:54, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from the Hiryu. At 12:45, they located the American carrier Yorktown and struck her with 3 bombs. Yamaguchi, receiving the report, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Now, launch the torpedo strike." At 13:30, 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters launched from the Hiryu. At 2:43, they hit the Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The American carrier, already damaged from the bomb impacts, was rendered dead in the water. To the Japanese pilots returning to the Hiryu, she appeared finished. Yamaguchi stood on his bridge, receiving the reports, and for a brief interval it seemed plausible that the Hiryu alone might alter the course of the battle. 1 American carrier damaged, possibly sinking. If they could locate and engage the other American carriers, if they could launch another strike before nightfall, if the Americans did not find the Hiryu first. But the Americans did find the Hiryu. At 5 o'clock, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown appeared overhead. Yamaguchi looked up, saw them approaching, and reportedly uttered a single word: "Shita." Damn. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu in rapid succession. Her flight deck exploded. Her hangar caught fire. Within minutes, she was ablaze as fiercely as the other 3 carriers. Yamaguchi stood on the bridge as smoke poured in, as the deck tilted, as officers reported that the fires were out of control. He turned to his staff. "All personnel will abandon ship. I will remain." His staff officers protested. Captain Tomo Kaku, the Hiryu's commanding officer, declared he would remain as well. "We will stay with the ship," Kaku stated. Yamaguchi shook his head. "The staff will transfer and continue operations. That is an order." But he himself would not depart. He was the carrier division commander. These were his ships. 3 had burned and sunk. The 4th was burning now. He would not outlive them. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were either burning or sunk. The Akagi burned throughout the night and was scuttled by torpedo the following morning. The Kaga sank that evening. The Soryu sank at 7:13 in the evening. The Hiryu burned through the night and sank at 9:12 the next morning. With them went 248 aircraft, 3,057 men, and Japan's capacity to project power across the Pacific. On the cruiser Nagata, Nagumo sat in a borrowed cabin, gazing into vacancy. Officers came and went, bringing reports, requesting orders. He responded mechanically, issuing necessary commands, but witnesses stated he seemed detached, his mind elsewhere. At one point, an officer overheard him say very quietly, as if to himself, "How did they know? How did they know we were coming?" It was the pertinent question. The Americans had known because they had deciphered Japan's naval code. They had read the transmissions, understood the plan, positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, and waited. Nagumo had sailed into an ambush, believing he possessed the element of surprise, believing the Americans were reacting to his movements, when in fact they had been lying in wait for him all along. Every assumption he had made, that American carriers were distant, that Midway was lightly defended, that Japan still held the initiative, every assumption had proven incorrect. On the Yamato, Yamamoto received the final reports as night fell. All 4 carriers lost. The American carriers remained operational. The invasion of Midway was impossible without air cover. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, he issued the order. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. All naval forces shall withdraw. Akagi, standing beside him, observed the admiral's countenance as the command was issued. He appeared, Akagi later chronicled, as if he had just signed his own death decree. Yamamoto had assured the Emperor and the Naval High Command that this crucial undertaking would annihilate the American carrier fleet and solidify Japan's defensive frontier. Instead, 4 carriers were lost, with no tangible gains. The conflict, which Japan had been dominating for 6 months, had just pivoted. In the ensuing weeks following Midway, as the magnitude of the catastrophe became undeniably apparent, Japanese naval officers grappled with comprehending the events. How could 4 carriers be obliterated in a mere 6 minutes? How did the Americans materialize at the precise location and at the exact opportune moment? Some attributed the outcome to unfortunate circumstances: the delayed dispatch of a reconnaissance aircraft from the Tone, the decision to reconfigure the ordnance on the plains, the timing of the American assaults. Others pointed fingers at Nagumo's hesitancy, Yamaguchi's detachment from the main battle group, or the entrenched doctrine requiring aircraft recovery prior to launching offensive strikes. However, in private discussions, within personal correspondence and journals, a more profound comprehension began to surface. Commander Mitsuo Fushida, the air operations chief responsible for the Pearl Harbor offensive, who spent the Battle of Midway confined to a sick bay recovering from an appendectomy, later stated, "We had presumed we held the strategic initiative. We had operated under the assumption that the Americans were merely reacting to our actions. We had believed surprise was unequivocally on our side." Every single one of these assumptions proved to be fundamentally incorrect. They were aware of our approach. They lay in wait for us. We advanced into an unforeseen trap, convinced we were the pursuers when, in reality, we were the quarry. This represented the fundamental shattering blow, the dawning realization that eroded Japanese morale. For a period of 6 months, the Kido Butai had operated with complete impunity. They had struck at will whenever and wherever they pleased, and the adversary had been utterly incapable of impeding them. That era concluded definitively at Midway. The Americans had not merely secured a tactical victory. They had unequivocally demonstrated their capacity to decipher Japanese strategic objectives, anticipate Japanese troop movements, and strategically deploy their own forces to effectively counter them. The entirety of Japan's wartime strategy, its rapid territorial expansion, its defensive posture, its emphasis on force preservation, was predicated on maintaining the offensive initiative. At Midway, Japan forfeited this crucial advantage and was never able to reclaim it. Nagumo returned to Japan under a cloud of disgrace. While he avoided formal censure, he was relegated to land-based commands, kept away from naval aviation operations, and eventually dispatched to Saipan, where he tragically took his own life in 1944 as American forces advanced upon the island. Yamaguchi perished alongside the Hiryu, becoming one of the rare Japanese admirals to fall in direct combat. Yamamoto continued his tenure as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, but met his end in April of 1943 when American fighter planes, guided by intelligence derived from intercepted communications, located and shot down his aircraft. Yet on the evening of June 4, 1942, as 4 aircraft carriers blazed and sank into the vast expanse of the Pacific, the Japanese admirals who bore witness to this devastating spectacle struggled to articulate the depth of their emotions. It transcended mere astonishment at the losses, immense though they were. It was not solely trepidation regarding the forthcoming repercussions, grave as they would be for the trajectory of the war. It was something far more profound. It was the sudden, disorienting apprehension that every conviction they held concerning their perceived superiority, their strategic advantage, and their assured triumph was demonstrably false. Captain Aoki, who miraculously survived the sinking of the Akagi and was subsequently rescued from the water, was questioned years later about his most vivid recollection from that fateful day. After a prolonged period of contemplation, he finally responded, "The silence." He elaborated, "Following the impact of the bombs, after the ensuing explosions, there was a moment of absolute stillness on the bridge. We all simply stood there, gazing at one another, and not a single word was spoken, for what could possibly be said? We had just witnessed the entirety of our strategic vision engulfed in flames." That profound silence, that instant of stunned comprehension, encapsulates the experience of the Japanese admirals at Midway.
It was not marked by dramatic pronouncements or theatrical displays of emotion, but by a quiet, devastating understanding that the war they had believed they were winning had irrevocably turned against them, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to reverse its course.